Hello, how are you? Here I will help you sleep with a crime story that has happened with the sound of comfortable rain. Of course, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to this channel for the good of all of us. Let's get started. Story 1. The morning of June 19, 2005, 27-year-old Morgan Canyupan was making his usual rounds as a cleaner along the banks of the Kaling River, Singapore. His job was straightforward: pick up trash, clear the debris, keep the area clean, nothing out of the ordinary. As he walked along the riverbank, his eyes landed on a large waterlogged cardboard box, sealed tightly with masking tape and half submerged in the mud. At first, he dismissed it as just another piece of trash. He reached down, intending to haul it away, but the moment he tried to lift it, something fell off. The box was heavier than expected, and the water damage had weakened it. It was barely holding together. Then, it gave way in his hands. A plastic bag tumbled out, wet and bloated from the river. Through the thin plastic, he could make out what looked like raw meat, swollen and pale. For a moment, he thought it was just discarded food. But then Morgan's breath hitched. His hands trembled as he staggered back. Taking in the details, he saw pale flesh, smooth skin, and a jagged, unnatural cut. The lower half of a human body lay before him, severed cleanly at the waist and the knees. Yet, something was even more unsettling. There was no stench of decay, no signs of decomposition. The skin looked fresh, eerily intact, as if this person had been alive just hours ago. A chill crept up his spine. With fingers slicked from river water, he fumbled for his phone. This episode may contain sensitive details and graphic imagery. Listener discretion is advised. Within minutes, police arrived at the scene. Officers taped off the area, and forensic teams moved in. The discovery of a severed torso was disturbing enough, but it was just one part of a larger mystery. Where was the rest of the body? To find out, authorities expanded their investigation, setting up a 2-kilometer search radius around the Kaling River. Special operations officers combed the banks, while the police Coast Guard sent boats into the water, scanning the currents for anything that might surface. Unfortunately, the investigation was filled with challenges. At first, investigators considered the possibility that the remains had drifted into Singapore's waters from elsewhere. After all, hundreds of ships pass through the Singapore Strait every day, so there was a high chance that the body was dumped at sea and carried inland by the currents. If that were the case, identifying the victim would be nearly impossible. Another challenge was the possibility that the missing body parts had been wrapped in plastic bags or cardboard, just like the first discovery. If that was the case, the strong currents could have carried them miles away, making them even harder to find. But then a breakthrough. About 200 m downstream, officers spotted something partially submerged in the water, a sealed red and white cardboard box. Inside the box, sealed within layers of torn newspaper, and was the upper torso of a woman. Her arms were still attached, resting stiffly at her sides, her hands curled unnaturally inward. The severed edges of her neck were cleanly sliced, as if by a sharp, heavy blade. There was no ragged tearing, no jagged wounds, just a smooth, deliberate cut where her head should have been. Though both parts of the body had been submerged in the water, the victim's skin remained eerily intact. There were few signs of bloating or decomposition, and little evidence that she had been dead for long. There was something about how the body was packaged that felt almost methodical. The torso had been carefully folded into the plastic bag, its edges tucked in, as if someone had taken the time to neatly arrange the remains. But who was this woman? Where was the rest of her? And what did she do to deserve such a gruesome fate? The recovered body parts were swiftly transported to a forensics lab, where investigators began piecing together the mystery. One of their first tasks was to determine whether the victim had originated from outside Singapore, perhaps from a passing vessel or an offshore boat. But that theory quickly began to crumble. The biggest clue came from one of the boxes she was found in. The upper torso had been found inside a red and white printer box, one originally used to package a Canon printer. Investigators traced the serial number and confirmed that this specific model had been intended for sale in Singapore. Whoever had placed the body inside hadn't brought the box from overseas. They had obtained it locally. But that wasn't the only clue. The body parts had been wrapped in newspaper that was printed locally, pages from a Singaporean Chinese publication. This revelation eliminated the theory that the remains had drifted in from the open sea. Whatever had happened to the victim had almost certainly taken place within Singapore's borders. Meanwhile, forensic specialists conducted multiple DNA tests to confirm whether both body parts belonged to the same person. They analyzed tissue samples, cross-checked genetic markers, and compared results with every available database. The results left no doubt. The torso and lower half were a match. Now only one question remained: her identity. To solve this, authorities in Singapore carefully lifted fingerprints from the victim's hands and ran them through an extensive fingerprint database. Every scan was cross-checked against thousands of records. Then a match. The victim was 22-year-old Lu Hongmei. With the victim's identity confirmed, investigators turned their focus to understanding who Lu Hongmei was, and more importantly, what happened to her. Lu Hongmei was a 22-year-old Chinese national from Chongqing, China. She had come to Singapore in 2003 in search of better job opportunities, and according to her work permit, was employed at Ajara Systems Singapore, a circuit board manufacturing company in Serangoon North. Everyone who knew Hongmei had nothing but good things to say. She was described as cheerful, hard-working, and well-liked among her peers. No one could recall her having any conflicts at work, and there was no indication that she had any enemies. But then, police uncovered something intriguing. They requested access to her personal locker at the company, hoping to find anything could offer insight into her life. Inside, tucked between some documents and personal belongings, they uncovered something unexpected. A note from the company's HR department. It was an official reprimand, a warning letter. According to the document, complaints had been lodged against Hongmei over an inappropriate relationship with her supervisor, a man named Leong Su-chor. With this revelation, police now had a new suspect. They sought out Leong Su-chor for questioning, but they were careful. The police didn't reveal what they knew, nor did they mention anything about Hongmei's fate. If he had truly done something wrong, perhaps he would reveal it himself. At 51 years old, Leong Su-chor was the picture of an ordinary Singaporean worker, a husband, a father of 3, and a factory supervisor at Ajara Systems since 1997. On the surface, his connection with 22-year-old Lu Hongmei seemed like nothing more than a senior guiding a younger employee. But beneath that surface, there was more. Leong had taken a special interest in Hongmei from the start. She was young, bright, and full of energy. Interestingly, Hongmei had received 2 promotions within a short time period at the company, which sparked a wave of quiet murmurs among her colleagues about favoritism. Before long, the rumors were confirmed. The employee and supervisor were having an affair. Over time, their relationship became increasingly bold. No longer confined to stolen glances, they were caught kissing and hugging at work, earning them both a formal warning from management. But despite the warning, they continued seeing each other. A young woman searching for connection in a foreign land, and an older man craving something beyond the monotony of his predictable life. But now, sitting across from investigators, Leong showed no emotion. His face was stiff, his tone measured. On the surface, he appeared calm. But the officers noticed something else. Something wasn't right. They started with a simple question: his relationship with Lu Hongmei. Immediately, Leong grew defensive. His posture stiffened, his tone sharpened. He dismissed the idea outright, insisting that he was a family man with a wife and children, that he had no such affair. Then, they brought up the letter of reprimand. His company had formally warned him about an inappropriate relationship with Hongmei. Leong exhaled sharply, brushing it off. He insisted that the incident had been blown out of proportion. The only reason he had been seen with Hongmei that day was because it was her birthday. That was all, nothing more. But as he spoke, one of the officers noticed something. Liang's hands, resting on the table, bore several scuff marks, small abrasions along his fingers and knuckles. Casually, the officer asked about them. Liang's jaw tightened. His fingers curled slightly as he muttered that it was nothing. The officer leaned in, asking him to show his hands. Leong hesitated. A brief pause. Then reluctantly he turned them over. His fingers twitched, and his entire hand trembled. The next step was Liang's home. When officers requested to conduct a search, he didn't hesitate. He agreed. As they moved through the apartment, they began to uncover a series of unsettling clues. In his living room, they found a stack of Chinese newspapers, the exact same publication as the ones used to wrap Hongmei's body parts. In his kitchen cupboards, they discovered plastic bags, identical to the ones used to bag the remains. And then, in the kitchen itself, they found something even more disturbing. A meat cleaver, with several chips on the blade, damaged in a way that was consistent with hacking through bone. Forensic experts initially theorized that if Liang was responsible for the murder, the most likely place for the dismemberment would have been the bathroom. It made the most sense. A space designed for easy cleaning, where blood could be quickly washed away down the drain. But when they stepped inside, the bathroom was spotless. There wasn't a drop of blood anywhere. If the bathroom was spotless, where did the dismemberment take place? And more importantly, was Liang even guilty? Investigators had their suspicions, and the evidence so far painted a damning picture. But suspicion alone wasn't enough. They needed proof. Hard evidence that could directly tie Liang to the crime. And soon they would get it. Back at the station, police brought Liang in for questioning again. An hour after hour, the walls began to close in. After close to 10 hours in custody, Liang confessed. He admitted to killing Lu Hongmei. But according to him, it wasn't murder. He claimed that she had wanted to die. It was, he told police, a lover's suicide pact. He insisted that Hongmei had willingly allowed him to strangle her first, proving her sincerity. But when it was his turn to follow through, he couldn't bring himself to do it. Instead, he panicked, and did what he thought he had to do to cover it up. According to Inspector Roy Lim, the lead investigator handling the interrogation, neither he nor his team believed a single word of his story. Just 3 days after Lu's remains were found, Liang Shuchu was formally charged with murder. If convicted, his fate was all but sealed. The death penalty awaited him. But there were a few critical questions that remained. What was the real motive behind her murder? And more importantly, where were the rest of her remains? When a crime like this happens, a brutal killing, a body dismembered, the remains scattered across the city, one question comes to mind. Why? A crime like this must have been driven by rage, obsession, passion. Maybe it was jealousy. Maybe it was revenge. But the truth? It was none of those things. From the moment Liang Shuchu was taken into custody, investigators knew they weren't getting the full story. His confession was full of contradictions. First, he claimed there had never been a relationship between him and Lu Hongmei. Then he admitted to the affair, but only after police confronted him with evidence. And when it came to the murder itself, Liang described it as a lover's suicide pact, one where she had supposedly let him strangle her first. But when it was his turn, he couldn't go through with it. To investigators, the story made no sense. If this was truly a crime of love, why did he go to such great lengths to hide her body? And more importantly, if he truly cared about her, why did his actions tell a different story? As police dug deeper, they found something chilling. This murder wasn't about love at all. It was all about money. Back at Liang Shuchu's apartment, Inspector Roy Lim carefully examined the bathroom, searching for any trace of evidence. But something immediately stood out. The space was spotless. No stains, no lingering smell of blood. Nothing. Which didn't make sense. If a body had been chopped up here, there should have been blood everywhere. It would have seeped into the grout, splattered onto the walls, clung to every surface. But at first glance, the bathroom was immaculately clean. As Inspector Lim stood there, scanning the area, something nagged at him. A memory from a case report he had read years ago. Over a decade earlier, in another Singapore murder case, British serial killer John Martin Scripps had lured a South African tourist to his hotel room, killed him, and dismembered the body in the bathroom. When police arrived, they were met with the same eerie scene. A crime scene too clean. No visible blood, no obvious signs of violence. But Lim's superior at the time had taken a closer look. And under the sink, hidden from plain sight, they found it. A single blood stain. And now, standing in Leon's bathroom, Inspector Lim wondered, had Leon made the same mistake? Remembering this, Lim decided to check under the sink, but found nothing. It wasn't until he crouched lower, inspecting beneath the toilet bowl, that he spotted it. A small red stain. Forensic tests later confirmed what he already suspected. It was blood. And it was a 100% match to Lu Hongmei. On June 18, 2005, just 3 days after Lu Hongmei's remains were discovered, 50-year-old Leon Shu Chao was officially charged with murder. At the time of his arrest, Leon's wife and eldest daughter were on a holiday in Thailand. The news of his arrest shattered the family, forcing them to abruptly end their trip and return to Singapore. There, they reunited with Leon's 2 younger children, his son and youngest daughter, as they braced for what was to come. Together, they attended his first court hearing, watching as the man they knew as a husband and father stood accused of an unthinkable crime. While the case had already dominated headlines locally, it also made extensive news coverage in China, particularly in Lu Hongmei's hometown. For those who had known her, the friends, neighbors, and extended family members back in China, the gruesome details of her death were too painful to comprehend. But the hardest part was telling her parents. Reports state that those who were close to the family couldn't even bring themselves to share the truth. The idea of Lu's mother and father learning that their daughter had not only been murdered but dismembered and discarded like trash was simply too much to bear. It's unclear how long Lu Hongmei's parents were kept in the dark, or how long those around them tried to shield them from the brutal truth. But a tragedy of this scale couldn't stay hidden forever. Eventually, the reality of what had happened to their daughter would reach them. And when it does, it would be nothing short of devastating. By now, it was clear Lu Hongmei had died a horrific death at the hands of Liang Xiuqiu, but there were still 2 crucial questions left unanswered. Why? And more importantly, how? To uncover the full truth, investigators needed one thing first: the rest of her body. After Liang's arrest, a 30-member special operations team combed through the banks and dense undergrowth surrounding the Kowloon River, scouring every possible hiding place. Meanwhile, the police Coast Guard deployed patrol boats, navigating the river's currents and tracing its path all the way to the open sea. If the rest of her body parts had been dumped into the water, there was a chance they had already drifted far beyond Singapore's shores. In response, investigators consulted the Singapore Meteorological Service to analyze the river's current patterns over the past few days. They needed to know where the water had been flowing and if something had been thrown into the river at a specific location, where it would likely end up after several days. Using weather data and current patterns, experts provided possible trajectories, helping police determine where to focus their search before it was too late. But there was another concern. It was possible that other cleaners at the pier had unknowingly collected the remains and tossed them into the trash without a second thought. If that had happened, the outcome would be far worse. Because by now, the rubbish would have already been incinerated. With time slipping away, a team of investigators rushed to the Tua's incineration plant, hoping to recover any remaining body parts before they were permanently destroyed. They had learned that trash from the Singapore River was collected and transported to Tua's for incineration every few days. And fortunately, the timing aligned perfectly. Liang had disposed of the remains just before his arrest, meaning they could have already been swept up and sent for disposal. For the next 10 hours, officers sifted through piles of garbage, searching for anything that could lead them to Lu Hongmei's missing remains. Then buried among the waste, they found it. A yellow plastic bag, tightly wrapped in newspaper. Inside was a decomposed human head. Nearby, they also discovered a pair of severed legs. The head was in such an advanced state of decay that visual identification was impossible. But forensic pathologist Dr. Tao Ing-sui was able to confirm the victim's identity through a malformed tooth in her mouth cavity, identical to the one seen in some of Lu Hongmei's photographs. With most of Lu Hongmei's body recovered, pathologists were finally able to confirm what investigators had suspected all along. She had been strangled to death. The bruising on her neck was consistent with ligature strangulation, a form of asphyxiation where pressure is applied using an object rather than bare hands. Unlike manual strangulation, which leaves distinct finger marks, ligature strangulation often results in a deep uniform bruise around the neck. And to investigators, the most likely cause was clear. The towel recovered from Lu Hongmei's apartment. But while this proved how she died, it still didn't explain why. Lu Hongmei had insisted it was a lover's suicide pact, that Lu had willingly let him take her life. But as investigators dug deeper, they uncovered something that made his story fall apart completely. 2 days before she died, Lu Hongmei had walked into a police station and filed a report. Her ATM card had been stolen, and whoever had taken it had been draining her savings, little by little, across multiple locations in Singapore. In total, she had lost $2,000, nearly everything she had worked for. To investigators, this wasn't just a theft. It could be the key to understanding why someone wanted her dead. They turned to the ATM surveillance footage, combing through clip after clip. Each time, the same figure appeared. A slim man, wearing a cap and hoodie, withdrawing cash from her account. And the moment they saw his face, there was no doubt. It was Liang Xiuquan. However, the investigation took an unexpected turn when police discovered that Liang Xiuquan had an identical twin brother living in Singapore. This raised a rather disturbing question. What if they accused the wrong twin? Forensic pathologist Dr. Tao Ing Sui explained that in cases involving identical twins, DNA evidence alone wouldn't be enough to determine the killer. Since identical twins share the same DNA, if their genetic material was found at a crime scene, it would be nearly impossible to distinguish between them. Inspector Roy Lim himself even wondered if Liang was covering for his twin brother, as there was a small chance that his brother was the true culprit behind this case. But that theory was quickly ruled out. Reports state that Liang's twin brother had a solid alibi for the days leading up to the murder and the day Lu was killed. There was also no evidence that he had ever met Lu Hongmei. That meant there was only one possibility. The man withdrawing money from her account, the man caught on ATM surveillance, was Liang Xiaoqiu. When confronted with the evidence, Liang brushed it off, insisting that he and Lu often played pranks with each other's ATM cards, and that he had already returned the money. But police found no proof of this. Not in his home, not in Lu's. And the more they investigated, the more obvious it became. This wasn't a prank. It was theft. 10 days after his arrest, Liang finally broke. He retracted his earlier statements and told the police what really happened. On June 13, 2005, Liang and Lu Hongmei had checked into a hotel room for one of their usual lovemaking meetups. After they were intimate, Lu went to take a bath. While she was in the bathroom, Liang saw an opportunity. He quietly rummaged through her wallet, took her ATM card and pocketed it. Once they left the hotel, Liang used her money to go on a shopping spree. It wasn't long before Lu realized something was wrong. Her ATM card was missing, and when she checked her account, so was her money. Panicked, she reported the theft to the police, and was advised to visit the bank for further checks. She was scheduled to go on June 15, 2005. But when Liang found out about this, fear set in. If Hongmei were to see the CCTV footage from the ATMs, she would recognize him immediately. And if she reported him, it wouldn't just mean theft charges. It would mean his secret affair exposed, his reputation shattered. If the truth came out, he could lose everything. His job, his family, the respect of those around him. And so, on the morning of June 15, 2005, just hours before Lu was supposed to go to the bank, Liang made a decision. He lured her to his apartment. The moment the murder was done, panic swelled in Liang's chest. The thought of confessing, of facing a death sentence, was unthinkable. There was only one way out. She couldn't be found. His gaze drifted to the kitchen, where a meat cleaver and rubber mallet sat within reach. Dragging her corpse to the bathroom, he set the cleaver against her joints and one by one, hammered down with the mallet, severing bone from flesh. The task was brutal, far more difficult than he had anticipated. But eventually, he had reduced Lu Hongmei to 7 different pieces. He wrapped each one carefully in plastic bags and cardboard boxes, sealing them. With the body dealt with, he turned to the bathroom. Every inch had to be scrubbed, every trace of blood erased. Taking his son's bicycle, Liang set out on the first trip, disposing of her feet, shoes, and personal belongings in separate locations, before returning home for the rest. Then he took a cab to Kaling River, where he dumped her torso and head. By 5 p.m., Liang Xiuquan was back home, and by 7 p.m., he was at work for his usual night shift. On May 3, 2006, nearly 11 months after his arrest, 51-year-old Liang Xiuquan finally stood trial in Singapore's High Court for the murder of Lu Hongmei. However, as he took the stand, he changed his story. He claimed the police had coerced his confession, specifically accusing Inspector Roy Lim of manipulating him. According to Liang, Inspector Lim had treated him kindly, even buying him Chinese herbal tea to earn his trust. He insisted that this false sense of security had pressured him into making statements that painted him in a worse light. Statements he now claimed were designed to strengthen the murder charge against him. But the evidence told a different story. Inspector Lim denied the allegation outright. He explained that a full week after Liang had already confessed, Liang mentioned feeling unwell, prompting Lim to go to Smith Street in Chinatown to buy him 2 bottles of herbal tea. To prove this, Lim presented his notebook, where he had recorded the sequence of events in detail, showing that the tea was purchased only after Liang had admitted to the murder, not before as Liang had claimed. With this, the judge ruled that Liang's confession remained admissible as evidence, and his attempt to shift blame onto Inspector Lim was nothing more than a desperate ploy to escape the news. Additionally, ATM security footage captured Liang withdrawing money from Hongmei's account just days before her death. This wasn't a tragic suicide pact, as he had claimed. It was theft, followed by a calculated attempt to cover up his crime. After 16 days, the judge delivered his verdict. This was no crime of passion. It was murder, driven by greed and self-preservation. Liang stole her savings, then stole her life, to keep his crime hidden. The dismemberment of her body showed not a grieving lover, but a man determined to erase his mistake. In his final words, the judge made a chilling comparison, saying, "The deceased's demise in the Galing flat on the 15th of June, 2005 was no spontaneous suicide. It was a horrific homicide. It was a most disgusting and despicable murder. Lu Hongmei died a very cruel, heartbreaking death." On May 19, 2006, Liang Zaichuan was found guilty of murder and sentenced to death. After nearly a year and a half on death row, he was hanged in Changi prison. On July 11, 2005, a funeral was held for Lu Hongmei after her remains were released. Since her body had been found in pieces, it had to be carefully sewn back together, with wax body parts used as replacements for the ones never recovered. Reports state that her sister and brother could not bring themselves to attend. Lu's coffin was filled with her favorite toys, books, and clothes before being cremated. Her ashes were then sent home to China. Story 2. Case we're about to delve into occurred almost 100 years ago in 1936. But while it happened a long time ago, this case remains unforgettable due to its unsettling intimacy and almost surreal nature. This was a crime driven by obsession and desire, culminating in an act so shocking, it still disturbs many to this day. It was the evening of May 19, 1936. A woman checks into a small hotel in Shinagawa, Japan, using a false name. She was polite and unassuming, drawing little attention as she settled into her room. Earlier that day, she had gone shopping, watched a film, and then upon returning to her room, treated herself to a massage and 3 bottles of beer. There was nothing outwardly remarkable about her, just another guest in a bustling city. But outside the walls of that quiet inn, the city was gripped by unease. Tokyo was in a state of unrest. A nationwide manhunt was in full force. Newspapers ran bold, frantic headlines, while radio broadcasts delivered constant updates. The victim was a well-known businessman named Kichizo Ishida. He had been found dead in a lodging in just days earlier. But it wasn't his death that shocked the nation. Rather, it was the gruesome condition of his body. At the crime scene, investigators found something that provided a crucial clue. A message scrawled with blood on the bedsheets that read, "We, Sata and Kichi are alone." The name Sata, spelled S-A-D-A, was also carved into Ishida's left arm. This was one of the key indications that Ishida's death was no accident. It was intentional, and most likely, deeply personal. His body bore clear signs of strangulation, evident from the bruising around his neck. But authorities soon realized that Ishida's genitals had been severed and were nowhere to be found. Witnesses from the inn reported that Ishida had been staying with a woman in the days leading up to his death. Further inquiries led them to identify this woman as Sata Abe. Soon, reports of supposed sightings of Sata flooded in from all over Tokyo, and the police were overwhelmed. Then, at 4 o'clock in the afternoon on May 20, 1936, detectives knocked on the door of the small inn in Shinagawa. When the woman answered, she calmly identified herself as Sada Abe. Her small frame and gentle demeanor didn't match the image of a brutal killer, and the officers couldn't help but hesitate. Was this the woman they had been relentlessly pursuing? The one responsible for a crime so grotesque, it had sent the entire nation into a panic? Instead of the ruthless murderer they had envisioned, she appeared calm and composed, not the monster the headlines had described. Sensing that the police weren't convinced, Sada Abe reached into the folds of her kimono and carefully retrieved something. As she slowly unwrapped it, the officer's expressions shifted from confusion to horror. You're listening to Haynes, an Asian true crime podcast. Brought to you by One Up Media. This episode may contain sensitive details and graphic imagery. Listener discretion is advised. In 1936, Japan was a nation that was straddling the line between tradition and modernity. The old ways still linger, but change is undeniable. Cities are growing, industries are booming, and Western influences creep into daily life. Yet, in the shadows of progress, remnants of the past remain untouched, especially in Tokyo's pleasure districts. For centuries, these districts had been the heart of entertainment and vice. Prostitution may be the world's oldest profession, but in Japan's red light quarters, a strict hierarchy determined a woman's fate. At the top were the highest-ranking courtesans, admired for their beauty, intelligence, and talent. Below them were the entertainers, who captivated wealthy patrons with music, dance, and conversation. But not every woman in this world found success. Those who failed to attract wealthy clients were forced into lower-class brothels, where they had little control over their fate. Here, the line between entertainer and prostitute blurred, leaving many with no real choices. This was the world that Sada Abe knew. Once a geisha and later a waitress, she had spent years moving through Tokyo's pleasure districts, a place where desire had a price, and love was often transactional. Sada Abe was born on May 28, 1905, in the Kanda district of Tokyo. She was the youngest surviving child in a family, known for making tatama mats, the traditional straw flooring used in Japanese homes. Her family wasn't part of the wealthy elite, but they lived comfortably. They were well respected in their community, financially stable, and had a good reputation. Sada's father, Shigeyoshi, was an honest businessman, though some described him as self-centered and indulgent. Her mother, Katsu, doted on Sada, allowing her freedoms that her older siblings never had. Unlike her siblings who worked in the family's tatama business, Sada was encouraged to explore music and the arts. She learned to play the shamisen, a traditional Japanese instrument, and took singing lessons. Although her childhood appeared stable on the surface, signs of trouble were already beginning to show. As Sada entered adolescence, she began to show signs of rebellion. She skipped school, spent time with boys, and wore fashionable makeup, something that was considered inappropriate for a young girl of her class at the time. Her parents, worried about her behavior, tried to rein her in. But during this period, something happened that would change her life forever. At just 14 years old, Sada was sexually assaulted by an acquaintance, an older student from Keio University. In the aftermath, her parents struggled with how to respond. Unsure of how to handle the situation, they made a decision that would set her on a very different path. They sent Sada to train as a geisha. Contrary to common misconceptions, geishas in Japan are not prostitutes. They are highly skilled entertainers, deeply rooted in Japanese culture and tradition. They dedicate years to mastering classical music, dance, and the art of refined conversation, serving as cultural ambassadors who entertain guests through performance rather than intimacy. The most esteemed move in elite circles, performing for the wealthy or government officials. However, not all attain such prestige. Those who enter the profession later in life or fail to secure patrons often struggle. For these women, many end up in lower-tier establishments, where the distinction between entertainment and prostitution becomes more blurred. Life as a geisha was nothing like Sada had imagined. She had entered this world too late. Real geisha began training as children, spending years mastering dance, etiquette, and music. Sada, already a teenager, was considered an outsider among them. She was treated as lesser, and instead of performing in elegant tea houses for high-ranking clientele, she was placed in the lowest tier of geisha work, providing companionship to men in ways that were far beyond conversation. Nevertheless, it was here that Sada truly learned the power of seduction. But it came at a cost. She contracted syphilis, a common but potentially fatal disease if left untreated. In 1925, being diagnosed with syphilis would only mean a lifetime of painful treatments and invasive medical examinations. There was no cure, only crude therapies that were often as harmful as the disease itself. Geisha were largely exempt from these routine health checks, as they were considered entertainers rather than sex workers. Prostitutes, on the other hand, were closely monitored by the government, forced to undergo frequent and often degrading medical inspections. For Sada, the distinction between the two professions had always been thin, but now it was meaningless. If society was going to treat her like a prostitute, forcing her into the same humiliating procedures and marking her as unclean, then why continue the pretense of being a geisha at all? At least prostitutes had control over their own earnings, worked on their own terms, and could abandon the rigid hierarchy of the geisha world. A world that would never accept them anyway. To Sada Abe, she likely thought that if she was going to be treated this way, she would do it on her own terms. For the next several years, Sada Abe moved between licensed brothels and the underworld of illegal prostitution. But that world was brutal. Clients were often violent, money was never guaranteed, and women were considered disposable, easily replaced, easily forgotten. But Sada refused to be just another woman lost in the system. She wanted more. More control, more security, more power over her own life. She was tired of being at the mercy of others, tired of scraping by while men used her and discarded her. She wanted more, and she was ready to take it. By 1936, years of drifting through the pleasure districts had left her exhausted. She had seen the uglier sides of desire, lived under the control of others, and struggled to find any real sense of security. She wanted stability, a fresh start, perhaps even a chance at a normal life. Eventually, she took a job as a waitress at Yoshidaya, a modest but well-regarded restaurant in Tokyo. It was a change from her past, a step away from the world of brothels and geisha houses. But it was there that she met the man who would alter the course of her life forever, Kichizo Ishida. Ishida was not an extraordinary man in any traditional sense. He wasn't powerful or famous. He was simply a businessman, the owner of the restaurant Yoshidaya, and a serial womanizer. Though he was married, he had a reputation for seducing his female employees, using his wealth and charm to draw them into his orbit. For most, he was just another unfaithful husband seeking distractions outside his home. But for Sada, Ishida was different. Unlike the men who had treated her as disposable, he showered her with attention. He was playful, indulgent, and unrestrained in his desires. With him, she felt wanted, not as a product to be bought, but as a woman to be adored. He fed something inside her that had long been starved, passion without restraint, affection without conditions. Within no time at all, their affair had escalated, turning into something neither of them seemed willing to control. They would disappear for days at a time, shutting themselves away in rented tea-house rooms, drinking, laughing, and making love without limits. On one occasion, sources state that they remain in a hotel bed for 4 days straight, lost in their own world. Sometimes, they would make love, while accompanied by the soft melodies of a geisha singing in the next room. Even as maids entered to serve them sake, they carried on as if no one were there. In those moments, nothing else mattered. No responsibilities, no consequences. Just a thrill of desire and indulgence. It was all-consuming, almost hypnotic. But soon, it would end in the most horrific way. One night, in the midst of their passion, Sada slipped a sash around Ishida's neck and tightened her grip. To her surprise, he didn't resist. He welcomed it. Encouraged by his reaction, they continued. Over time, Sada became bolder, testing new ways to heighten their pleasure, while Ishida's tolerance for risk grew. What started as a thrill was now a routine, an unspoken game of trust and control that only deepened their obsession with each other. But for Sada, it wasn't enough. To her, the thought of Ishida returning to his wife or lying in another woman's arms was unbearable. The idea that she was just another passing indulgence tormented her. Jealousy crept into every moment, eating away at her until it became something darker, something dangerous. A single thought began to take shape in her mind. If she couldn't have him forever, then nobody would. After 2 weeks of indulgence, Their affair finally came to an end. Ishida returned to his life, his restaurant, his wife, his responsibilities. But for Sada, there was no returning to normal. The separation left her restless, on edge. She tried to silence the thoughts with alcohol, drinking excessively to dull the ache. But it wasn't enough. She could not let him go. On May 9th, Sada attended a play in which a geisha, driven mad by jealousy, lashed out at her lover with a knife. The scene unfolded with raw intensity. The woman's fury, the man's betrayal, the final act of desperate possession. Sada sat motionless, her breath shallow, her fingers tightening in her lap. To her, this wasn't just a performance. It was a reflection of the thoughts that had been circling in her mind for days. The idea had already taken root, but now it burned with clarity. The next time she saw Ishida, she wouldn't come empty-handed. 2 days later, on May 11th, Sada prepared to meet Ishida once again. Another night of passion awaiting them. But this time she had a plan. Before meeting him, she stopped at a pawn shop, gathering pieces of her clothing to sell. The delicate silks and fine fabrics that once clung to her skin were now nothing more than currency, traded for a handful of bills. With the money in hand, she walked to another store and carefully selected a kitchen knife. She slipped it into her bag, her fingers grazing the cold steel, feeling its weight against her palm. As she set off toward Ishida, her heartbeat quickened. Not with doubt, not with fear, but with certainty. That night, as they lay together once again, Sada finally pulled the knife from her bag. The scene from the play she had watched days earlier replayed in her mind. The geisha, consumed by jealousy, threatening her lover with a blade. Now Sada was reenacting it. Pressing the cold blade against Ishida's chest, she accused him of dressing up for another woman. Her voice was sharp and trembling with rage. Ishida flinched, startled for a moment, but to Sada's surprise, a slow smile began to spread across his face. Amused by her jealousy, he leaned into the danger, teasing her, testing her resolve. Before long, the tension between them morphed into something else, reigniting their passion. Wild, reckless, and unrestrained, at one point, Sada slid the knife down his body, pressing the blade against the base of his genitals. Leaning in close, she whispered that she would make sure he never touched another woman again. Ishida just laughed. For the next 2 nights, they pushed each other further, exploring the edge between pleasure and pain. At Sada's command, Ishida would wrap his hands around her throat, squeezing until she teetered on the brink of unconsciousness. She would also do the same to him, and both of them would be lost in the dangerous thrill of control and surrender. But on the evening of May 16th, as their bodies moved together, Sada reached for her scarf and slipped it around Ishida's neck. This time, a little tighter than usual. She watched as he writhed beneath her, his body tensing under the strain. Again and again, they repeated the act, each time holding on a little longer, each time pushing the limits a little further, until the boundary between pleasure and suffocation blurred beyond recognition. But then, something changed. The last time Sada tightened the rope, she might have put in too much strength, and Ishida's face began to grow distorted, his features twisting with discomfort. The pleasure that had once fueled their game was gone, replaced by something unsettling, something wrong. Ishida groaned, his body struggling to recover, muscles locked in. Tension that refused to fade. Desperate for relief, he reached for a bottle of Calmodin and swallowed 30 tablets, hoping that the powerful sedative would dull his pain. As the sedative dragged him into drowsiness, Ishida turned to Sada, his voice slow and uncertain. He asked if she was going to do it. If she was going to wrap the cord around his neck again while he slept. This was not a plea for mercy nor a request, just a question lingering between them. And then, as if resigning himself to whatever came next, he told her that if she did, she could not stop halfway. That, he said, would be far worse than dying. Sada sat still, watching him drift between wakefulness and sleep. Was this what he truly wanted? Or was he simply surrendering to whatever she decided to do next? She let the question hang in the air. As Ishida drifted into sleep. And at 2 a.m. on May 18th, as he lay motionless beside her, Sada reached for her scarf, wrapped it twice around his throat and pulled tight. This was the very last breath that Ishida would take. For several hours, Sata lay beside Ishida's lifeless body, holding him close as if nothing had changed. The warmth had already begun to fade from his skin, but she didn't recoil. Instead, she embraced him, pressing her face against his chest, inhaling his lingering scent. But lying with him wasn't enough. She needed something more. Something permanent. Reaching for the kitchen knife, Sata pressed the blade to his body and with careful precision, severed his penis and testicles. Blood pooled beneath him, soaking into the sheets. But she remained steady, wrapping the detached flesh in a magazine cover before tucking it away. This was her keepsake. Something to carry with her. Something that would make him hers forever. When morning came, she dressed herself in Ishida's underwear and left the room. But before stepping out of the inn, she turned to the staff and calmly told them not to disturb him. The next day, Sata locked herself away in a quiet room, dedicating hours to writing farewell letters. One was meant for Omiya, the man she had once loved. Another was addressed to a close friend. And the final letter, perhaps the most painful, was written to Ishida himself. With each carefully chosen word, she tried to put into writing what could never truly be explained. She had already made her decision. A week from now, she would end her own life. But before that, there was something she couldn't let go of. Beside her, wrapped carefully in paper, lay the last physical piece of Ishida, the part of him she had taken as her own. Slowly, Sata unwrapped it, her fingers trembling, but it wasn't fear that made her hands shake. It was longing. What Sata did next defied all reason. She ran her fingers over the lifeless flesh, and then grabbed it with her hands. Lifting it to her lips, she pressed it gently against her mouth, closing her eyes, trying to summon the illusion that he was still with her. But it didn't stop there. At one point, she even removed all her clothes and tried to insert Ishida's severed genitals into herself. As if that could somehow revive what had been lost. As if she could reclaim the intimacy that death had taken from her. But no matter how many times she tried, it was futile. Ishida was gone, and nothing could ever bring him back. Frustrated yet undeterred, she made one final plan. She would flee to Osaka, carrying Ishida's remains with her. And when the time came, she would climb to the cliffs of Mount Ikoma, and throw herself into the abyss with his flesh clutched tightly in her hands. However, before she could do that, there was a knock on her door. At 4 p.m., the local police arrived at the inn, following reports of a woman traveling under a false name. Sata answered without hesitation. There was no fear, no attempt to run. Instead, she met their gaze with an air of quiet amusement. She told them there was no need for formality. The officers hesitated, unconvinced. The woman who was standing before them was soft-spoken, composed, and did not match the image of the fugitive they had been hunting. But then, Sata reached into her pocket, retrieved something, and slowly unwrapped it before their eyes. The detectives recoiled in horror, because in her hands were the severed remains of Kichizo Ishida. Sata Abe was arrested and subjected to 8 rounds of interrogation, each session peeling back the layers of her unsettling devotion. When asked why she had severed Ishida's genitals, her response was chillingly simple. She couldn't take his entire body with her, so she took the one part that held the most vivid memories. But it was her explanation for the murder itself that truly fascinated the nation. Records state that as she spoke, her eyes sparkled with an eerie excitement. She confessed that she hadn't killed Ishida out of jealousy, but out of love. As long as he was alive, he could still be with other women. But in death, he would belong to her alone. Sata Abe's trial began on November 25, 1936, drawing massive public interest. By dawn, crowds had already gathered outside the courthouse, eager to witness the proceedings. Her crime captivated Japan, not just because of its brutality, but because of the raw, obsessive passion behind it. Before receiving her sentence, Sata made a final statement, insisting that she was not the sexual deviant the public had made her out to be. She spoke of Ishida as unlike any man she had ever known, claiming that while she had been with others out of affection rather than money, no one had ever made her feel the way he did. But no matter how deep her love had been, murder was still murder. On December 21, 1936, she was convicted of murder and mutilation of a corpse. The prosecution had pushed for a 10-year sentence, but interestingly, Sata herself claimed she deserved the death penalty. In the end, She was sentenced to just 6 years in prison and was sent to Tochigi Women's Penitentiary, where she was registered as prisoner number 11. 4 years later, in 1940, her sentence was commuted as part of Japan's 2600th anniversary celebrations of its mythical founding. Then on May 17, 1941, exactly 5 years after the murder, Sada Abe walked free. After her release, Sada Abe faded from public life. But her story never did. The details of her crime took on a life of their own, twisting into myth and speculation. Among the most infamous rumors was the reason behind Sada's obsession. Many believed that Ishida's manhood was likely of an extraordinary size, the key to her uncontrollable desire. However, the officer who interrogated Sada dismissed the rumor entirely. Ishida, he claimed, was physically unremarkable. He had even asked Sada about it directly, but she only laughed, brushing off the idea. Size, she insisted, had nothing to do with her obsession. It was his skill, his passion, and the way he made her feel that had consumed her completely. After Sada was sent to prison, Ishida's severed remains were sent to Tokyo University Medical School's Pathology Museum, preserved and labeled as a curiosity. Years later, after World War II, they were put on public display. A grim relic of one of Japan's most infamous crimes. But after some time, the display vanished without any explanation. As for Sada Abe, the last known record of her was her death in 1971 at Discovery. In the early days of April 2023, police in South Korea received a call about a tragic scene near the Daecheong Dam in Daejeon, 140 kilometers south of Seoul. What they found was harrowing: a shallow grave containing the remains of a woman. The body was soon identified as a missing 48-year-old resident of Gangnam, Seoul. This discovery weighed heavily on the investigators. Her disappearance had been reported just days earlier, and now their worst fears were tragically confirmed. With the location of the body established, detectives turned their attention to Gangnam, the last place she was seen alive. To find out what really happened to this woman, they needed to retrace her steps and fast. Witnesses reported seeing her near her home on the night she vanished. In a district like Gangnam, with its maze of traffic intersections and ever-watchful security cameras, there was a chance that whatever had happened to her had been captured on film. Without hesitation, the team of officers began combing through hours of grainy footage from nearby cameras. Then, at one quiet intersection, they found it. At the bottom of the screen, the timestamp flickered. March 29, 2023, 11:49 p.m. The video shows a darkened street, illuminated only by the faint glow of streetlights. A car rolls into frame, slowing as it approaches the intersection, its headlights piercing through the darkness and casting shadows across the pavement. As the vehicle comes to a stop, both of its front doors swing open, and two men step out purposefully. Suddenly, the footage flashes, and a new camera angle reveals a woman on the ground next to the car. She thrashes and kicks, her movements wild with desperation. One of the men grips her arms tightly, struggling to maintain control, but her resistance is fierce. Her legs kick out, her body twists, and for a brief heart-stopping moment, it seems that she might actually break free. Eventually, she manages to wriggle out of the man's grip, her arm flailing desperately toward the street, but the man lunges forward, grabbing her again with renewed force. His hand clamps over her mouth, muffling her screams. His grip is unrelenting, and slowly but surely, he begins to overpower her. He drags her toward the car, her heels scraping against the asphalt and leaving faint streaks behind. Every second feels like an eternity, but with one final effort, he forces her closer to the open door and shoves her into the back seat. The car dipped under her weight, bouncing once as the door slammed shut. The man then sprints to the front of the car, climbs into the passenger seat, and within moments, the vehicle speeds off, disappearing into the night. The footage leaves no room for doubt. This is no random act of violence. It is a calculated and brutal abduction, carried out in the heart of Gangnam, one of Seoul's most affluent districts. But the crime's origins trace back months earlier, to an investment that went disastrously wrong. A cryptocurrency crash had set off a catastrophic chain of events, and those who had poured their trust and their savings into what they believed was a golden opportunity were now on the brink of desperation. Fortunes vanished overnight, replaced by anger, betrayal, and a desperate need for answers. For most, the devastation ended with financial ruin, but for others, it ignited something far darker. When the numbers turned red, lives were shattered, and for the woman, her fate would unravel in the worst possible way. The woman in the CCTV video was positively identified as the victim, whose body had been discovered near the Daecheong Dam. Investigators connected the two through witness reports, the timing of her disappearance, and the clothing seen in the footage, which matched what she had been wearing when she was last seen alive. But the video alone wasn't enough to explain why she was taken, or why she was murdered. What could have driven a group of individuals to such extreme lengths in the heart of one of Seoul's safest districts? Gangnam is a symbol of South Korea's modernity and prosperity. Known for its many luxury boutiques, towering skyscrapers, and high-end lifestyles, it's a place where safety and security are deeply prioritized. South Korea as a whole is recognized as one of the safest countries in the world, and violent crime is exceptionally rare. But in a place like Gangnam, it's nearly unthinkable. The district streets are lined with hundreds of surveillance cameras, and its neighborhoods are frequently patrolled by private security. And that's what made the events of March 29, 2023 so shocking. They shattered the illusion of safety, leaving a city grappling with how such a horrifying crime could unfold in one of its most protected neighborhoods. Due to the sensitive circumstances surrounding the case, the 48-year-old victim's name has not been made public in any available sources. However, with her identity confirmed and the details of her abduction coming to light, investigators turned their focus to her life, searching for anything that might explain why she had been targeted so brutally. They interviewed her family, friends, and colleagues, building a picture of a woman whose life on the surface seemed ordinary. But as they dug deeper, a more complex narrative began to emerge. She wasn't just a private individual. She was someone with significant influence in a specific, high-stakes world. As investigators delved deeper, those closest to her described a woman deeply entangled in business dealings, someone who often shared advice and opportunities with those around her. But they also spoke of strained connections, relationships that had shifted from trust to tension over time. Piecing the information together, one common thread began to stand out: her involvement in cryptocurrency, and in that unforgiving market, the seeds of this crime were sown. Cryptocurrency is a world built on promises of wealth, innovation, and freedom from traditional financial systems. But most, if not all, know that beneath its glossy surface lies a volatile and unpredictable market, where fortunes can skyrocket one day and collapse the next. It's a world that's notorious for its high risks and constant conflict. With little regulation and built-in anonymity, it automatically becomes a breeding ground for fraud, betrayal, and crime. For the investigators working on the case, it didn't take long to uncover the victim's connection to this world. For the past few years, she had been working for a cryptocurrency firm called Pure, spelled P-U-R-E, a company that had once promised groundbreaking success in blockchain innovation, but had become embroiled in financial controversy. But South Korea, a global hub for cryptocurrency, has seen its fair share of such scandals. One of the most infamous was the collapse of Terra and Luna, two tokens created by Korean crypto entrepreneur Do Kwon. As the co-founder and CEO of Terraform Labs, Do Kwon oversaw a company that once promised financial revolution, until their catastrophic crash in 2022 wiped out fortunes overnight and sent shockwaves through the global market. Cases like this revealed the vulnerability of even seemingly successful projects and highlighted the devastating consequences of unchecked greed and mismanagement. It was in this climate of uncertainty and scandal that Pure, the company tied to the victim, operated. Based on police investigations, the victim's last known clients were a couple, Yu Seung-wen and his wife Hwang Wen-hee. Sources indicate that the victim first approached the couple during a time when cryptocurrency, particularly her own project, Pure, was experiencing a surge in popularity. She presented herself as knowledgeable and trustworthy, leveraging her role at Pure to highlight the company's innovative blockchain solutions and the potential for massive returns. Over a series of meetings, she builds a rapport with the couple, providing detailed explanations of the technology behind Pure and showcasing the early successes of similar projects. She assures them that investing now means securing their future, and insists that this is the best time to capitalize on the opportunity. Drawn in by her confidence, Yu and Hwang ultimately decide to invest over 1 billion won, or about 700,000 US dollars. At the time, they believed they were making a life-changing decision. But in early 2021, their hopes are shattered when the coin's value plummets by more than 95%. In an instant, their investment is gone, leaving them with almost nothing. The trust they placed in the victim curdles into anger. Now their loss isn't just financial anymore. It has become personal. With the discovery of the victim's body, her background in cryptocurrency, and the chilling CCTV footage of her abduction, police had assembled the most critical pieces of the puzzle. They knew the crime was likely targeted and meticulously planned, but there were questions that still remained unanswered, one of which was the identities of the men captured in the footage. To answer these questions, investigators looked into the vehicle's make, model, and license plate number. While the records do not explicitly state whether the vehicle was rented or personally owned, investigators likely used the license plate captured in the video to trace its origin. This is a standard procedure in cases like this, and it proved to be a critical lead. Through the vehicle's registration, they identified a name, Lee Kyung-woo, and a brief background check of the man revealed a troubling history. Lee Kyung-woo's life had once been steady. As the owner of a health club, he had built a modest but stable business, earning enough to support himself and maintain a sense of independence. But come the year 2020, the COVID-19 pandemic turned his world upside down. The lockdowns and restrictions forced his business to close, wiping out his primary source of income. Desperate for a way out, turned to cryptocurrency, investing what remained of his life savings into the pure coin. But by early 2021, his hopes were crushed, and he was left financially ruined. To the police, these findings were enough to link him to the crime and elevate him as a prime suspect. But why would someone like Lee Kyung-woo target the victim? There was no doubt that she was affiliated with Pure, but she wasn't its founder or CEO. So why her? A plausible explanation at this point is that Lee, unable to reach those at the top, redirected his anger and desperation towards someone connected to the coin that had devastated his life. To him, anyone connected to Pure wasn't just a contributor to his financial ruin. They had betrayed him, and Lee was on a relentless mission to make them pay. But here's where things take a turn. As investigators delved deeper into Lee's phone and financial records, they uncovered something startling. There were multiple phone conversations between Lee and the Yu couple. This connection completely shifted the focus of the investigation and opened the door to a far more complex conspiracy. In the many text messages exchanged between Lee and the couple, there was a clear pattern of desperation and anger that emerged. Both sides harbored intense resentment toward the victim, especially the couple, who blamed her for persuading them to invest a significant amount of money into a coin that ultimately crashed. Their shared frustration over losing so much money created a bond, and the messages revealed just how deeply they blamed the victim for their misfortune. But one of these messages was particularly chilling. Amid their discussions about the conflict with the victim, sent a text referencing her, ending with the haunting words, "Shall I get rid of it?" Before the year 2021, the cryptocurrency Pure gained an immense amount of traction among enthusiasts and investors. Among them were Yu Sang-won and his wife, Hwang Eun-hee, had been persuaded to invest by someone they trusted. The 48-year-old female victim, at the heart of this case. Persuaded by her expertise and the Pure coin's rising reputation, the couple poured more than $700,000 into the venture. However, by early 2021, Pure had collapsed, losing more than 95% of its value. For Yu and Hwang, this was catastrophic. The fortune they had worked so hard to build was gone in the blink of an eye. The couple quickly pointed fingers at the victim, the woman who had persuaded them to invest, blaming her for their financial downfall. But they weren't alone. As the crash of the coin rippled through the community, the victim became a focal point for growing tensions and mounting disputes. One of those disputes was with Lee Kyung-woo, a former law firm employee and someone with ties to the same cryptocurrency firm. Lee, like many others, had lost everything when Purist value plummeted. The only difference was that Lee was more than just angry. He was desperate. In the months that followed the crash, tensions boiled over. However, the situation had become rather complex as there was a tangled relationship between Lee, the Yu couple, and the victim. To put it simply, Lee and a group of other investors, including the victim, had suffered massive losses when Purist value collapsed. In the aftermath, their frustration turned toward Hwang Eun-hee, Yu Sang-won's wife. Hwang had a significant personal stake in the coin. Her family's investment was massive, and she was likely doing everything she could to boost its value. But in her efforts to keep the coin afloat, it seems she may have inadvertently contributed to its crash. This only fueled the anger of Lee and the other investors. They saw her as someone whose actions had caused their losses, and they demanded compensation for what they believed was manipulation of the token's price. The pressure mounted, and eventually, Huang paid out close to 200 million won, or just over $145,000, to settle the dispute. Interestingly, however, this payment was later deemed an act of extortion by local authorities. Among the group that was seeking restitution, Li and the victim played key roles in pressuring Huang to hand over the money. But while they may have received some payout from Huang, their victory was short-lived, because the resentment had deepened. Sources state that the Yu couple viewed both the victim and Li as threats, holding them personally responsible for their financial collapse. But their anger wasn't evenly distributed, because they placed more blame on one than the other. This growing hostility set the stage for something much darker, because not long after, the Yu couple approached Li with an offer. 70 million won in exchange for a solution that would end their conflict with the victim for good. In other words, that's about $50,000 for Li to get rid of the problem. While Li had once stood against Huang and Yu, the allure of money and his own desperation led him to switch sides. What began as a financial dispute was now quickly spiraling into a cold and calculated plan for murder. The plan was as ruthless as it was straightforward. But for the Yu couple, this wasn't just about revenge. They wanted more. Their sights were set on the victim's remaining wealth. If Li could recover her passwords and access her cryptocurrency accounts, it would mean even more money to cover their losses. For them, the murder wasn't the only goal. It was just part of the payoff. But Li knew he couldn't pull it off alone. It's possible that the thought of committing the crime himself crossed his mind, but he likely realized that the risks were too great. So he turned to someone he trusted, his former college classmate Huang Dehan. Like Li, Huang had been hit hard by financial struggles and was desperate for a way out. The two shared an unspoken understanding, bound by their need to escape the weight of their circumstances. Together, they recruited another accomplice, 30-year-old Yun Ji-ho, an unemployed man with mounting frustrations of his own. For Yun, this wasn't just an opportunity to make quick money. It was a way to feel like he had control over his life again. Li was assembling a team, not just to carry out a crime, but to ensure he could distance himself from the dirtiest parts of the job. And in his mind, if they succeeded, he would walk away with clean hands and a pocketful of cash. To ensure the plan would succeed, they enlisted a fourth individual whose sole job was to track the victim. 4 days, this person followed her movements, studying her daily routine, her patterns, and her vulnerabilities. To make the plan work, every single detail mattered. As the date of the crime drew closer, Li began devising the method he would use to ensure that the victim wouldn't leave the encounter alive. He considered various methods, but they all led to the same conclusion. He needed a tool that could get the job done quickly, while leaving as little evidence behind as possible. It's likely that multiple possibilities crossed his mind. He may have thought about more conventional methods, such as strangulation or using a weapon. But those came with significant risks, leaving evidence causing a scene, or the plan falling apart in the heat of the moment. He was looking for something discreet, something that wouldn't immediately raise suspicion if it were ever traced back. And that's when ketamine came into the picture. His access came through his wife, a nurse at a plastic surgery clinic, where ketamine was routinely used in surgical procedures. For Li's plan, it was the perfect solution. Li likely rationalized that a few injections of the drug would not only sedate the victim, but also render her vulnerable enough to extract the cryptocurrency passwords and keys. But he knew that ketamine wasn't just a sedative, it could be lethal in high doses. And that was exactly what he needed. Sources state that Li's wife did indeed supply him with the ketamine, but it's unclear how much of his plan she truly understood. Did she know he intended to use it to commit murder, or did she believe it was for something entirely different? Regardless of what she knew, Li secured the drug, fully aware of its deadly potential. With the team in place, their preparations complete, and the date set, everything was now in motion. And on March 29, 2023, the time had come to put their plan into action. With the police investigation underway, the hunt for the perpetrators quickly began to yield results, as evidence and leads started to point directly to those responsible for the brutal crime. The CCTV footage obtained by the police clearly showed Li and his accomplices directly involved in the abduction. Therefore, the evidence against them was undeniable. However, the police needed to uncover the full scope of the crime. In particular, identifying every single individual who was involved and ensuring they would face justice. Lee's phone record showed calls and messages with several individuals, including Huang Daihan and Yun Jiho. Tracing his financial transactions, police uncovered a suspicious payment of 70 million won from Yu Song-won and his wife Huang Un-hee. This payment was no coincidence. It connected the couple to the crime, raising more questions about their involvement. Within weeks, police arrested Lee, Huang, Yun, and the Yu couple. But even as the suspects were brought in, the full story of what had happened and why was still unraveling. It was becoming clear that this was a premeditated operation. And the most incriminating evidence came from Lee's financial transactions, a 70 million won payment from the Yu couple. This raised a critical question. What exactly were they paying Lee for? When police looked deeper into their connection, they discovered the ongoing disputes over the cryptocurrency Pure. The Yu couple's financial losses. By mid-April 2023, they also uncovered a key piece of the crime. The ketamine used to kill the victim, traced back to Lee's wife, a nurse at a plastic surgery clinic. For the police, it was a major breakthrough. They now had the alleged mastermind, his accomplices, and the couple who had paid for the crime. All that remained was to deliver justice. As the suspects faced trial, the full extent of their crime came to light. Prosecutors painted a picture of greed, betrayal, and cold-blooded murder. The evidence was overwhelming. CCTV footage of the abduction, phone records showing material, meticulous planning, and the financial trail that led directly to the Yu couple. Lee Kyung-woo initially confessed to the crime, but later recanted, claiming his confession had been coerced and that he never intended to kill the victim. Huang Daihan, his close accomplice, pointed fingers back at Lee, insisting that Lee had orchestrated every detail. Meanwhile, Yun Ji-ho admitted his involvement in the crime, offering little defense. On the other hand, the Yu couple denied ever paying Lee to commit the murder, claiming that the money paid to him was for unrelated reasons. However, the court found their explanations unconvincing, concluding that they had financed the crime in a desperate bid to recover their losses and take revenge on the victim. After months of testimony, the final verdict was delivered. Lee Kyung-woo and Huang Daihan were found guilty of murder and sentenced to life imprisonment. Their accomplice, Yun Ji-ho, received a 25-year sentence for his cooperation and lesser role in the plot. As the supplier of the ketamine used in the murder, Lee's wife was also convicted and sentenced to 5 years in prison. One of the most haunting aspects of this crime was the verdict of the Yu couple. Although they were not directly involved in the killing, many critics argue that the couple deserved equally harsh punishments. After all, they were the ones who financed the crime. Without their money, it's unlikely that Lee would have carried out such a calculated and brutal act. Critics point out that by paying Lee $70 million, the couple not only enabled the crime, but also ensured its success, making them just as responsible for the outcome as those who physically carried out the murder. Their role, though indirect, was pivotal, proof that their desire for revenge and greed outweighed any sense of morality. Ultimately, they were found guilty of conspiracy to commit murder. Yu Sing-won received an 8-year prison sentence, while his wife, Huang Un-hee, was sentenced to 6 years. Story 4 was May 2019 in Binh Duong, a province in southern Vietnam. A man arrives at a house he had recently purchased in a quiet district. It was a modest home, nothing out of the ordinary. A single-story structure with white walls, a small courtyard, and a living space that had been left untouched for weeks. But before he could even step inside, something struck him as odd. The house was sealed shut, several padlocks hung from gates, doors, and entrances, as if someone had gone to great lengths to keep people out. One by one he broke them open, and after a while, with the outer barriers cleared, he turned to the main door. He slid the key into the lock, twisting it with a firm click. With a slight push, the door creaked open. As he stepped into the living room, his eyes landed on something strange. Scattered across the room were religious books, their pages filled with complex teachings and unfamiliar symbols. Some were stacked neatly, while others lay open, as if left behind in a hurry. Beside them, rolls of adhesive materials, duct tape, silicone sealants, and plastic sheets. And then in the bedroom, there was a blue plastic water tank, large, sturdy, and completely out of place. Curious, he stepped closer. It stood firmly in the bedroom, its surface smooth and unmarked. Something about it felt off, too large to be storage, too out of place to be furniture. He knocked twice, expecting the hollow ring of an empty container. But instead a dull, muted sound. The tank was dense, packed and sealed. Planting his feet, he pushed against the side, trying to shift it even slightly. But it barely moved. Whatever was inside wasn't just heavy, it was unnaturally so. He stepped back, wiping sweat from his brow, his pulse quickening. Then, hesitating only for a moment, he stepped closer. Curiosity creeping in, he grabbed the lid and took it off. And that's when he saw it. Strands of dark, matted hair, trapped beneath layers of hardened cement. This wasn't trash, this was a person. You're listening to Haynes, an Asian true crime podcast. Brought to you by 1UP Media. This episode may contain sensitive details and graphic imagery. Listener discretion is advised. Still reeling from what he had just seen, the man staggered back, his breath uneven. Then footsteps. His workers had arrived. They had come expecting a routine clean-up. But instead, they were about to witness something horrifying. As they stepped inside, their eyes landed on the blue plastic tank. Some hesitated, others moved closer, drawn to the strands of hair trapped beneath the hardened cement. A tense silence followed, and the realization settled quickly. Without another moment's hesitation, the homeowner reached for his phone. It wasn't long before police arrived, their patrol cars pulling up to the quiet street. Inside, they moved swiftly, scanning the scattered religious books and adhesive materials. But their focus immediately locked onto the sealed plastic tank in the bedroom. The strands of hair trapped in the cement left no doubt. They were dealing with a body, but something else also caught their attention. Outside, in the backyard, officers spotted another barrel, nearly identical to the one inside. But this one was in far worse condition. The plastic had buckled and split open in places, and the cement inside had fractured, revealing jagged cracks along its surface. Whatever was inside had been sealed away. But now, time and the elements had begun to break it apart. One officer stepped closer, his eyes scanning the damaged plastic tank. At first, it was difficult to tell what lay beneath the layers of hardened concrete, but something about it seemed off. As he examined the break more closely, he noticed irregularities in the surface, areas where the cement appeared uneven, as if it had hardened around something solid inside. Small gaps had also formed, but the concrete had crumbled away, and among the rough, fractured surface, a few strands of hair peeked through, eerily similar to what had been found inside the house. This was likely another body. Within minutes, the entire property was locked down, police tape stretching across the perimeter as forensic teams moved in. What had started as one gruesome discovery had now escalated into something far more disturbing. A house concealing not one, but two bodies, buried in layers of cement, hidden in plain sight. Over the next few hours, police carefully removed the bodies from both barrels and transported them for forensic examination. Days later, autopsies confirmed the victims were two men, and through fingerprint analysis, their identities were revealed. The first victim was 50-year-old Tran Duc Lin, and the second was Tran Tri Tan, aged 27. With the bodies identified, police shifted their focus to the people who had lived in the house previously. Whoever they were, they had gone to great lengths to disappear. As they had left behind no personal belongings, no clear signs of recent activity, and no immediate clues as to where they had gone. Investigators dug into property records, combing through rental agreements, utility bills, and transaction histories to track down the previous occupants. Their search soon led to two names, Pham Thi Tien Ha and Trin Thi Hong Hoa, the most recent tenants of the house. But had these women vanished to cover up a crime? Or was there another reason for their sudden departure? There was also another detail, something that made the crime scene even more unsettling. Scattered across the house were strange religious texts, some carefully arranged, others left open, as if a ritual had been abandoned mid-act. Had these beliefs led to murder, or been twisted into something far darker? And if so, what exactly had happened inside that house? As police worked to piece together the timeline, the autopsy reports provided a crucial detail. The two victims had likely died about a month before their bodies were discovered. When investigators reviewed rental records, they found something that raised even more suspicion. The two female tenants had vacated the house around the same time, approximately a month prior to the discovery of the bodies. This timeline was too precise to ignore. The first real break in the case came from neighbors. Some recalled seeing a small group of women living there, but their behavior had always seemed unusual. Unlike the other homes in the area, where families and tenants came and went freely, this house remained closed off from the world. When the women did step outside, it was brief, discreet, and without conversation. Eventually, police questioned the neighbors about when the tenants had left, but most had no clear answer. No one had seen them pack, no moving trucks had arrived, and there had been no signs of a departure. Within hours, a nationwide search was issued for the two women. About 50 kilometers away from the crime scene, in Thursday Chalmot City, life moved at a different pace. The streets were calm, the air thick with late afternoon heat, and in a modest hotel tucked away from the main roads, guests came and went without drawing much attention. Inside, the atmosphere was quiet, the soft hum of air conditioning, and the occasional murmur of conversations at the front desk. It was the kind of place where no one asked too many questions, a temporary stop for travelers passing through. But in one of the upper floor rooms, a group of 4 women had been staying longer than most. By now, news of the gruesome discovery in Binchang had spread across the country. Nationwide alerts were issued for Pham and Trin, the 2 women identified as the previous occupants of the house and key suspects in the case. Their names and faces were plastered across newspapers, aired on television, and distributed to law enforcement agencies nationwide. And as it turned out, someone was paying attention. At the hotel front desk, an employee was likely flipping through the morning paper. The headline stood out immediately. 2 women wanted for questioning in connection with bodies found in a water tank. A glance at the accompanying photos and the employee's stomach tightened with unease. The employee didn't react or show alarm, but in a quiet, calculated movement, they turned toward hotel security and discreetly whispered what they had just realized. Within moments, a call was placed and police were on their way. But upstairs, Pham and the others were already on edge. They had been in hiding for weeks, moving carefully, ensuring their presence remained as unnoticed as possible. But now, something fell off. Maybe it was the way the hotel staff had started glancing in their direction. Or maybe it was pure instinct, the same instinct that had kept them one step ahead until now. Whatever the reason, Pham wasn't about to ignore it. Without hesitation, the group prepared to leave, grabbing their belongings and heading downstairs to the front desk. They asked for their identification back, but the receptionist hesitated for a moment, just long enough for Pham to sense that something was wrong. Then, the hotel's main entrance had been locked. Before they could react, the distant glow of red and blue lights flashed through the lobby windows. On May 18, 2019, Pham T. Tien Ha and Trin T. Hong Hoa were arrested on suspicion of murder. Along with them, 2 other women had been traveling in their group, were also taken into custody. Their arrest was a breakthrough for investigators, but the case was far from over. There were still critical questions left unanswered. Why were 2 men murdered and encased in concrete? What really happened inside that house in Binchang? And most importantly, who was Pham T. Tien Ha? Before she was a wanted fugitive, Pham T. Tien Ha was just another ordinary woman living in Ho Chi Minh City. Records state that she was educated, driven, and independent. The kind of person who seemed to have her life figured out. In her late 20s, she opened a coffee shop in a prime location. A cozy yet modern space that quickly became a favorite among locals and travelers alike. She poured everything into the business. Her time, her passion, her savings. And for a while it paid off. Her life was stable, comfortable, successful. But somewhere along the way, something changed. At some point in 2017, her focus began to shift. The coffee shop, which was once the center of her world, no longer seemed to hold the same importance. Her mind was elsewhere. And then, almost overnight, she walked away from it all. She closed her business, distanced herself from old friends, and withdrew from the life she had built. Why? Because she had found something new. She had discovered Fa Luan Gong, a practice that, to outsiders, appeared to be nothing more than a form of spiritual meditation. But beneath its surface, Luan Gong was known as one of the most controversial and divisive spiritual movements in the world. While it promoted inner peace and self-discipline, many critics accused it of being a cult, enforcing extreme beliefs and strict, unwavering devotion from its followers. For Farm, it may have begun as a simple curiosity, but it quickly consumed her, leading her down a path that would ultimately end with 2 men dead at her hands. With the suspects now in custody, investigators were finally in a position to piece together the truth. Now the 4 prime suspects in the case were sitting across from them in the interrogation room, and it was time to hear their side of the story. But before they could understand why the 2 men were murdered, they needed to uncover what they had been involved in, and how they had ended up in that house to begin with. The answers, it seemed, were hidden in plain sight. When the police first entered the house, they found stacks of religious texts with their pages filled with complex symbols and spiritual teachings. There were also rolls of adhesive materials, duct tape, silicone sealants, plastic sheets, all used to seal off rooms, restrict movement, and block out the outside world. In preliminary interviews, neighbors told police that they recalled strange, silent gatherings at night. They spoke of figures moving behind the covered windows, and sometimes the faint murmur of voices chanting words they couldn't understand. To the outside world, it was just another house. But inside, it was something else entirely. One by one, the 4 women were questioned. At first, they spoke calmly, methodically, as if none of this was unusual. There was no panic, no visible guilt, but something about them fell off. As part of standard procedure, police conducted a background check to see if the 4 suspects had any prior records or connections to each other. It turns out, the 4 women were followers of Falun Gong, one of the most controversial spiritual movements in the world. Initially led a small but dedicated group of followers, all practicing under her strict guidance. No one knows for sure how many members she had at the start, but various reports estimated to be between 4 and 10. Over time, some of the members began to walk away. Perhaps it was the harshness of the practices or the rigid rules that she imposed, but whatever the reason, their numbers thinned. But among those who stayed was Fam's own mother. As the group shrank, those who remained became even more cut off, because Fam had no intention of letting them stay connected to the outside world. Determined to keep the group together and to continue their practice in absolute secrecy, she made a decision. In October 2018, she rented a house in Binjiang, far from prying eyes, where the remaining members could devote themselves fully to their beliefs. This was the very house where the 2 bodies would later be found. It was clear that Fam was the one everyone listened to, the one who made the decisions. And when it came to death in the group, she didn't hesitate. According to Fam, the entire ordeal began with the first victim, Lin. She told police that his death was a choice he made on his own, insisting that neither she nor her followers had played a direct role in it. It happened during one of her strictest rituals yet, a 14-day absolute fast. No food, no water, only meditation and faith. To Fam, this was a test, a way to separate the worthy from the weak. And in her eyes, Lin was too weak. She claimed that after just a few days without food, Lin had completely broken down. He could no longer endure the fasting and the isolation. And so one night, he tried to escape. But he never made it. Fam told police that in his attempt to escape, he threw himself from a second-floor window and committed suicide. But even in death, Lin remained trapped within the group. There was no funeral, no report to the authorities. His body was simply left in a room hidden away from sight. As the days passed, the air in the house grew heavy with the scent of decay. Eventually, when the stench became unbearable, the group stuffed his remains inside a plastic water tank, filled it with concrete, and sealed it shut with tape. This was the order given from Fam. But Tun's case was different. Unlike Lin, Tun had stayed. In the weeks that followed, life inside the group continued as normal, or at least as normal as it could be under her rule. The fasting, the isolation, the strict discipline, nothing had changed. But Lin's death had left something behind. A lesson. A warning. Tun had witnessed firsthand what happened to those who couldn't keep up. And for a while, he did what he could to fall in line, to avoid drawing attention. But no matter how hard he tried, a constant reminder lingered in the room. The plastic water tank. It sat there unmoving, sealed, heavy and silent. Tun may not have spoken about it, but he knew what was inside. What had happened to Lin. And maybe deep down, he knew what would happen to him if he didn't listen to Pham. In the weeks that followed, Tan's faith began to waver. He began to struggle with the teachings, just as Lin had. During her police interview, Pham stated that Tan had once been deeply committed to the group, even immersing himself in the routines and distancing himself from the outside world. By all accounts, he had been fully committed to Falun Gong. But according to Pham, he was slowly becoming corrupted, drifting too far from their teachings and resisting any attempt to change. In her version of events, Tan's defiance had begun with small transgressions. While the others fully committed to their fasting rituals, he allegedly snuck food in secret, breaking what Pham saw as a sacred purification process. To her, his violations weren't just physical, they were spiritual. She claimed he had begun harboring impure thoughts, showing signs of desire, and craving earthly pleasures that defied the strict discipline she imposed. Then one day, Tom crossed a line. Pham caught him masturbating inside the house, something she saw as an unforgivable act. In her mind, this wasn't just a personal failure. It was a contagion, a sign of moral weakness that could possibly be spread to the others in the group. To her, it was a sickness that had to be cut out before it spread. And there was only one solution. Pham did not intend to kill him outright. Instead, she isolated him, locked him inside a room, and left him there alone. No food, no water, no human contact. He was given only time. Time to repent. Time to reflect. Time to suffer. As the days passed, Tan's body began to weaken. His muscles grew sluggish, his mind foggy from dehydration and starvation. Eventually, he was so weak and malnourished that his health was in severe decline. Then one day, Pham entered the room. She stood over him, watching as he struggled to move, to speak, to hold himself upright. And then in a voice calm and assured, she told him not to worry. She would heal him. Shortly after, she sent for one of the women in the group to buy an electric actuator, a device that's commonly used in acupuncture treatments, meant to restore balance, ease pain, and bring the body back to health. At least, that's what she wanted him to believe. By the time the machine arrived, Tun was already too weak to fight back. Under Pham's instructions, the women pressed the device against Tan's body, sending a sudden jolt of electricity coursing through him. His muscles seized. His breath hitched and a sharp, involuntary gasp escaped his lips before his body slumped to the floor. But it wasn't enough. He was still alive. So Pham stepped forward to finish what she started. She reached down, wrapped her hands around his throat, and began to squeeze. For the next few days, Tan's body remained untouched, left in the room as if it no longer existed. Meanwhile, the others carried on with their practices, completely unfazed. But the smell soon became impossible to ignore. They couldn't leave him there forever. And so, they followed the same method as before. Another barrel was brought out. His body was lowered inside, concrete poured over him, the container sealed shut with tape. After months of investigation, Pham Tien Ha and her followers stood trial for the murders of Tran Duc Lin and Tran Triton. She stood before the court and justified everything, claiming that Lin had chosen to take his own life, that his death was not their responsibility. As for Tan, she argued that his execution had been necessary, a purification to rid the group of his spiritual corruption. Her followers echoed her words, but when pressed, they insisted that they were only following orders. However, the court refused to accept their version of events because the evidence painted a far more brutal reality. Lin's death wasn't as simple as Pham claimed. His autopsy showed signs of physical trauma, raising questions about what really happened. If he had truly taken his own life, why was his body kept hidden for days? Why hadn't anyone sought help? And then there was Tun. He had been locked away and starved, left to grow weaker until he was barely able to fight back. Then he was electrocuted and strangled to death. His murder was clearly premeditated. This was never about purification. This was about control, submission, power. Pham was not just a spiritual leader. She had isolated, manipulated, and ultimately executed those who no longer fit into her vision of the group. And the other women, they had stood by and allowed it to happen. They could have stopped it. They could have walked away. But instead, They helped cover the bodies in concrete. To the court, there was only one conclusion. This was murder. After a lengthy trial, the verdict was delivered. Pham Ttien Ha was sentenced to death, while her mother, Trin Thi Hong Hoa, and the two other women, Tao and Hu Yen, received prison terms ranging from 13 to 22 years for their involvement in the crimes. The spiritual practice of Falun Gong originated in China in the early 1990s. Its followers believed that through meditation, slow-moving exercises, and moral teachings, they can achieve spiritual enlightenment and even supernatural abilities. While some consider it a spiritual discipline, many critics and even governments have labeled it as a cult. One of the most controversial and extreme cases linked to Falun Gong involves its practitioners rejecting modern medical treatment, believing that illness should be cured solely through spiritual cultivation and meditation. This has led to cases where followers have refused life-saving medical care, relying instead on meditation and their faith. However, Falun Gong is also at the center of a far more disturbing allegation. In 2006, reports surfaced claiming that some practitioners in China were being systematically targeted for organ harvesting. Investigations allege that some political prisoners, primarily those who believed in Falun Gong, were being executed on demand to supply China's organ transplant industry. Today, over 10 countries have banned Falun Gong, citing it as a threat to public order or national security. Although Pham Ttien Ha and her group claimed to follow Falun Gong, Vietnamese media reported that her practices deviated significantly from its core teachings. Rather than adhering to the belief's traditional principles, Pham created her own interpretations like extreme fasting, long periods of self-isolation, and even self-imposed exile. Some people argue that Pham's actions had little to do with Falun Gong itself, and that media coverage of the case was shaped to cast the practice in a negative light. But in the end, this was never just about faith. It was about power. Pham Ttien Ha didn't guide her followers toward enlightenment. She led them into darkness. And when belief is twisted into blind obedience, the line between devotion and destruction disappears. Story 5. On a warm summer night in June 2005, in the city of Gwangju, South Korea, Jung Eugene sat in his small apartment, weary from another long day at Gwangju Inua School, where he worked as a full-time teacher for deaf and disabled students. The soft glow of his desk lamp flickered against the walls as he focused on preparing lessons for the next day. Then, the sharp ring of his phone shattered the quiet, jolting him from his thoughts. The call that followed would unearth decades of buried horror. Jung picks up the phone. A brief pause. A faint crackle on the line. Then, a voice shaky, uncertain. "Hello, is this Teacher Jung? My daughter's friend. She was assaulted." Silence. The mother's voice lowers to a whisper. "What should we do?" Jung freezes. The words hang in the air, heavy and suffocating. How does he even begin to respond? The next morning, Jung walks into Gwangju Inua School. His thoughts race, but his purpose is clear. He already knows where he has to go. The school nurse. She's been here for years. Someone the students trust. Someone who should care. If anyone will take this seriously, it should be her. He finds her in her office, papers stacked haphazardly on her desk. Without hesitation, he tells her everything. The phone call, the girl's story, the horror that had been whispered to him the night before. But the nurse's reaction is nothing like what he expected. She barely reacts. She doesn't flinch. Doesn't ask for details. "Forget about it," she says. Jung feels his breath catch. His hands tighten into fists at his sides. Did she misunderstand him? Did she not grasp the gravity of what he just said? As he looks into her face, he realizes she understood perfectly. She just didn't care. Teacher Jung then turns to other teachers and colleagues at the school, desperate for someone to acknowledge what's happening. One by one, he asks them if they've heard anything, if they know what's going on. But all of their answers are eerily similar. Don't get involved. Just let it go. Jung refuses to walk away. If the teachers won't help, then he'll go to the one person who has to listen. The principal of the school. Jung steps into the office, facing the man in charge. He recounts everything, the mother's call, the girl's story, the disturbing accusations. But in response, "Be quiet," the principal says. At that moment, Jung begins to realize the truth. This wasn't just about one man, one crime, or one girl's suffering. This ran much deeper. Gwangju Inoa School wasn't hiding one predator. It was shielding many. What teacher Jung was about to expose would go on to become one of the most horrifying scandals in South Korean history. This was a case of unchecked abuse, systemic corruption, and a legal system that failed its victims at every turn. But it would take years for the horrors of Inua School to come to light. But when it finally did, it ignited national outrage, so intense that the country could no longer look away. No one had listened when the students first cried for help. But soon, South Korea would have no choice but to hear them. To the outside world, Gwangju Inua School appeared to be a place of learning, care, and support for children with disabilities. Established in 1961, the school was founded with a clear purpose: to provide education for deaf and disabled students in a society that often overlooked them. It was the first of its kind in Gwangju, a city that was steadily growing into an economic and cultural hub in South Korea. Many parents had placed their trust in Inua School, believing it to be a safe haven, where their children would be cared for and given the support they needed. Government officials even commended the institution, praising the generosity and dedication of its administrators. To the outside world, this institution was a symbol of hope. But beneath that carefully crafted image lay something far more troubling. Gwangju Inua was a family enterprise, one built on power, control, and secrecy. It was owned and operated by the Kim family, who controlled nearly every major position within the institution. At the top was Chairman Kim, the school's founder. His influence ensured that the school remained eligible for government funding and private donations. His eldest son was Principal Kim, a respected public figure of the institution. He was known for his charitable work, and also for consistently securing funding from several religious organizations and private benefactors. But the real power rested with Vice Principal Kim, the younger son. While his father and brother handled finances and public relations, he controlled the day-to-day operations in the school. He decided who was hired, which students were admitted, and how discipline was enforced. Within the school's walls, his authority was absolute. Many of the staff had close ties to the family, whether as relatives or longtime associates. While those in leadership positions were chosen as much for their loyalty as for their ability to maintain the school's operations. On paper, the institution provided essential services for students with disabilities, which justified its steady stream of funding. However, several alumni accounts and later investigations painted a different picture, one of systemic financial mismanagement. Records state that the school had inflated its enrollment numbers to receive extra government funding, even for students who didn't exist. Donations, whether money, supplies, or equipment, often never reached the children. Instead, many of these items were quietly resold for profit. Students were also used as free labor, forced to do physical work under the guise of school maintenance and training. Some of these children were left with lifelong injuries as a result. Despite clear signs of financial misconduct, no one questioned where the money was going. There were no audits, no oversight, and no accountability. Authorities saw no reason to intervene, and any concerns that were raised were dismissed. For decades, Gwangju Inua School was controlled by a single family. The funding never stopped. The school remained open, and no one dared to ask what was really happening inside. But the corruption ran far deeper than just money. While the Kim family's pockets got larger, it was the students who paid the price. Because the school was designed for students with disabilities and hearing impairments, many had to live on campus. And since Inua was one of the few institutions in the region that catered to their needs, families often had no other choice. Some children were sent there because their parents couldn't afford to care for them, while others had no parents at all. Some had disabled parents themselves, who had little choice but to entrust them to the institution. For these children, Inua wasn't just a school. It was their entire world. The rules were strict, but not in the way a school should be. They weren't about discipline or structure. They were about control, about keeping the students obedient, isolated, and afraid. Misbehavior wasn't met with detentions or extra assignments. It was punished with beatings, starvation, and days of solitary confinement. These children weren't just students. They were treated as property. From the very start, The financial aid intended for the students never reached them. Instead, it was taken by the Kim family for their own benefit. But for them, money alone wasn't enough. They also wanted free labor. Children as young as 8 years old were forced to work around the school, including construction and maintenance tasks. They were given tools and expected to carry heavy materials, tear down walls, and assist in renovations. While they were under the supervision of administrators, safety was never a concern. The only purpose of these administrators was to ensure that the students obeyed orders. Records state that if a child collapsed from exhaustion or dared to protest, the consequences were immediate: beatings, starvation, or days spent in isolation. Years later, records would reveal that many children suffered broken bones, untreated infections, and lasting physical damage. But forced labor wasn't the only way the school exploited its students. The Kim family soon realized they could profit from them in another way, one that took them beyond the school's walls. Some of the students were taken into the city and made to parade through crowded streets under the guise of fundraising for disabled education. Dressed neatly in school uniforms, deaf children were trained to perform rehearsed sign language routines, signing messages about how much the Inua school needed support. For many onlookers, it was a heartbreaking sight. People stopped in their tracks, watching in silence. Some moved to tears as they reached into their pockets, dropping cash into donation boxes, convinced they were helping vulnerable children. But the reality was far from what they believed. None of that money went toward education. It never provided better food, medical care, or improved conditions for the students. Instead, it disappeared, siphoned into the hands of those who controlled the school. Yet this was only part of the horror. There was something far worse. The first signs of sexual violence at Inua school were subtle, hidden beneath the guise of discipline and favoritism. It started with small acts. A male teacher placing a hand on a student's back, then a little lower. A pat on the head, followed by a whisper, too close to the ear. A teacher calling a female student into his office after class, only for her to leave in tears. At first, many students didn't understand what was happening. Most, if not all, had never received any proper education about bodily autonomy. No one had taught them what was appropriate and what wasn't. But then, the patterns became impossible to ignore. The same children were being called to the same offices, the same dormitories, always late at night. They would return silent, shaking, unable to make eye contact. At the heart of all the abuse was Vice Principal Kim. Before the horrifying truth was exposed, most saw him as nothing more than an administrator, a man responsible for maintaining order at the school. But to the students, he was something far more terrifying. He was a predator. State that Kim would carefully select his victims, watching them closely, learning which ones were the easiest to manipulate. He targeted the most helpless. Orphans, children with no families, those with nowhere to run, and no one to believe them. And he wasn't alone. Other teachers, staff members, even administrators, either participated in the abuse or chose to stay silent. Some joined in without hesitation. Others simply looked the other way, knowing full well what was happening, yet refusing to risk their own positions by speaking out. Because at Inua school, silence wasn't just expected, it was necessary for survival. One night, Kim summoned a young girl to his office. She was no older than 11. Another child who had nowhere else to go, forced to live on campus like so many others. She had heard the whispers, seen other girls return from his office in tears, unable to speak about what had happened. She didn't fight back. She knew it wouldn't matter. Kim bound her hands and feet, ensuring there was no escape. For the next 15 hours, she endured unimaginable horror, trapped in that room as he did as he pleased. When it was over, she was sent back to class, expected to sit at her desk, open her textbooks, and pretend nothing had happened. No one asked where she had been, because no one dared to. The records also state that certain teachers had favored students, not because they excelled in class, but because they were easier to control. Girls were singled out, given extra attention, called to the front of the classroom under the pretense of guidance. Some students were told to stay after class. Others were called to the teachers alone, given small rewards. Snacks, better grades, special privileges. before being subjected to things they didn't fully understand. On one occasion, a female student was summoned after school, believing she was in trouble for poor performance. Instead, she found herself alone with her teacher, who locked the door behind her. When she finally left, she was shaking, her uniform disheveled, her eyes red from crying. However, she said nothing about the incident, likely because she already knew what would happen if she did. At night, when the halls were empty and the school doors were locked, the dormitories became even more dangerous. Because certain teachers had the keys to the rooms where the students slept. One night, a female student, who was no older than 12, woke to the feeling of hands moving over her body. Disoriented, she opened her eyes to see her teacher kneeling beside her bed. The student tried to scream in fear, but the teacher pressed a finger to her lips. "Be quiet," he said. She had no choice but to listen, because she knew what happened to students who resisted. She had seen what had happened to others. Students who fought back were often met with brutal punishments. Some were dragged out of their dorms and beaten in front of the entire class. Others were taken away for hours at a time, returning before sunrise, walking unsteadily, their heads down, their faces pale. There were no simple punishments at Inwa school. If a child spoke out of turn, if they did poorly on a test, or even if they looked at a teacher the wrong way, there were consequences. And these consequences were often unspeakable. On one occasion, a 12-year-old female student was accused of talking back to a teacher. As punishment, she was dragged into the staff room and had the door locked behind her. She would not leave that room for the next 10 hours. Another student, a boy who had seen something he was never meant to, was beaten so badly that he was unable to walk for days. In another instance, a student was caught trying to warn a classmate through sign language. As punishment, his hands were tied behind his back, and he was forced to kneel for hours, blindfolded, while staff members passed by, striking him at will. But even these punishments were not the worst. Because at Guangzhou Inwa School, some punishments ended in death. In the year 2011, a former teacher of the school came forward with a chilling confession. He had worked at the IMAW in the 1960s. Back then, the abuse had already begun. But no one outside the school knew about it. And according to him, at least 2 children never made it out alive. One was a 6-year-old boy. He had been locked away for days without food. When he was finally let out, he was too weak to walk. His body was covered in bruises, his ribs pressing through his skin. The vice principal beat him again. This time, he didn't get back up. His body was wrapped in a cloth sack and buried outside the city. The second was a 6-year-old girl. She had been caught trying to sneak food after being starved for days. For this, she was locked in a room with no windows, no light, no food, and no water. By the time the door was unlocked, she was gone. The teachers didn't call the police. They didn't tell their parents. They simply disposed of her body, as if she had never existed. No records, no investigation, only silence. The students of the Inwa school lived in constant fear. They slept lightly, knowing that at any moment, a teacher could walk into their dormitory and choose them. And for years, they had no one to turn to. If they told a teacher, they would be punished for lying. If they told the police, no one would believe them. If they told their families, the school would retaliate. And so they endured it. For decades, they suffered in silence. Until in 2005, someone finally spoke up. In 2005, a man named Zhang Yujin joined the Guangzhou Inwa School as a teacher. But he wasn't just any teacher. He understood the challenges his students faced in a way that few others could. Having been born hard of hearing, Zhang had spent his life navigating a world that often overlooked or failed to accommodate people with disabilities. Rather than letting those struggles hold him back, he dedicated himself to special education, determined to support students who, like himself, needed someone to truly listen and advocate for them. When he was hired at the school, he believed he had found a place where he could truly make a difference. He saw himself in the children, their isolation, their challenges, their need for someone who actually cared. But it didn't take long for him to realize that something was deeply wrong. At first, he noticed that certain students would freeze when a teacher walked by, their eyes wide with fear, their shoulders tensing, as if preparing for something they couldn't escape. Then, he noticed that some would flinch at the lightest touch, even an innocent pat on the back or a hand on their shoulder. Many students would also avoid eye contact, keeping their heads down, trying to disappear. Teacher Zhang began to see the patterns. Certain children refused to be alone with specific staff members, always finding excuses to stay close to their classmates. Some girls would also cling to each other in the hallways, their hands tightly intertwined. Something was deeply wrong. Then he started hearing stories. A girl who refused to enter a teacher's office alone. A boy who had mysteriously disappeared for days, returning bruised and silent. Rumors of nighttime visits to the dormitories, where certain students were taken and never spoke about what had happened. Zhang could no longer ignore it. He began to ask questions. But when he approached other staff members, their responses were always the same. Stay out of it. This is how things are here. Forget about it. But Zhang could not forget about it. And soon, he would come across the one story that would change everything. It happened late one evening. Zhang was going over lesson plans when his phone rang, breaking the silence. A woman's voice came through, shaky and hesitant. She explained that her daughter had overheard something terrifying. A girl at the school had been taken to the vice principal's office. Night after night. Each time, she was promised snacks and kindness. But once inside, the door would shut, and she would be left alone with him. The girl had tried to tell someone, a teacher, a nurse, the principal himself. But each time, she had been dismissed, ignored, or silenced. Zhang felt his stomach twist. He had heard the whispers before, seen the fear in his students' eyes. But this was different. This wasn't just another rumor. This was a direct plea for help. For a moment, he couldn't speak. He wanted to tell the mother that everything would be okay, that he would take care of it. But deep down, he knew that this was bigger than him. When the line ended, Zhang made a decision. He would find out the truth himself. But knowing the truth wasn't enough. He needed proof. The next day, he began asking questions. Carefully, discreetly, he reached out to students he suspected had suffered the most. The ones who never spoke. The ones who avoided eye contact. The ones who flinched at a simple touch. Most were too afraid to say anything, shaking their heads and hurrying away the moment he tried to speak with them. But then he found her. A girl whose name had surfaced more than once in hushed whispers, whose eyes widened in fear every time the vice principal passed by. At first, she wouldn't meet his gaze. But Zhang was patient. He offered her safety, reassurance, a chance to be heard. He sat across from the girl, watching as her hands trembled in her lap. She was barely a teenager, but she carried the weight of someone who had spent a lifetime surviving. Zhang signed to her, reassuring her that she was safe. No more secrets. No more silence. At first she hesitated, her fingers twitching, as if unsure whether she should speak at all. But then slowly the words began to flow. She described how the vice principal would call her to his office late at night, offering small comforts, snacks, kind words, anything to lure her in. Her friend would come with her, but once they arrived, the vice principal would send the other child away. And then the door would lock. She tried to tell people, teachers, the school nurse, even the principal himself. But no one listened. As she signed, her movements became more frantic, as if the words had been trapped inside her for too long. Zhang listened. He didn't stop her, didn't rush her. He just let her speak. And for the first time, her story wasn't just being heard. It was being recorded. He stored the tape carefully, knowing it was more than just footage. This was evidence, a weapon against the people who had spent years hiding behind their authority. But he also understood what it meant to have this in his hands. This wasn't just about exposing the truth. It was about survival. Once the school found out what he had done, they would come for him. Zhang didn't take the tape to the school board. He didn't go to the police. He knew better than that. Instead, he brought it to a counseling center that specialized in sexual violence cases, particularly those involving disabled victims. When he placed the tape on the table and explained what had been happening inside the Guangzhou Inua school, the response was immediate. The counseling center filed a formal report to the police. And just like that, after years of silence, The crimes of Inua School were finally being dragged into the light. But the school had been watching, and they weren't about to let decades of secrets unravel without a fight. The girl who had spoken out immediately became the school's next target. One night, she was summoned to the cafeteria. She wasn't given a choice. When she arrived, she found herself surrounded, not just by the vice principal, but by several other staff members. They sat her down, placed a glass of alcohol in front of her, and told her to drink. The alcohol burned her throat. But they didn't stop there. They then began to coach her, forcing her to repeat the words over and over again. She was made to consume large amounts of alcohol and repeat those words until they were satisfied. Then, they turned on the camera and made her say them one last time. The next day, the school submitted the tape to the police. And suddenly, what should have been an open and shut case became something far more complicated. The police didn't dismiss the allegations entirely, but they didn't act on them either. Instead, they called it a conflicting testimony situation and put the case on hold. Weeks passed, then months. No arrests were made. No investigations were conducted. The school continued operating as if nothing had happened. And the only person facing real consequences was teacher Zhang. In response to the allegations, the school terminated his employment. They claimed that Zhang was simply spreading false rumors, causing unrest, and damaging the school's reputation. They painted him as a troublemaker, accusing him of fabricating lies, and attempting to tear down an institution that had supposedly dedicated itself to helping students. But Zhang wasn't surprised. He had seen this coming. What the school hadn't expected was that he wouldn't leave quietly. Zhang took his case to the Labor Relations Commission, arguing that his dismissal was retaliation for exposing the crimes hidden within Inua School's walls. He gathered evidence, documented everything, and fought back against those who wanted him gone. And after a year-long legal battle, he won. The school was forced to reinstate him. But walking back onto that campus didn't feel like a victory. The moment he stepped through the gates, he felt the suffocating weight of cold stares and the whispered conversations that stopped the moment he walked by. The same teachers who once greeted him now refused to look him in the eye. The staff who had once worked beside him now watched his every move. He was followed, harassed, isolated, treated like an outsider. But Zhang had already lost everything. His career, his safety, his reputation. There was nothing left to protect but the truth. And for the first time, after years of silence, the world was about to listen. 4 years, the horrors inside Gwangju Inua School had remained buried, ignored by authorities, silenced by fear. But in November of 2005, PD Note, one of South Korea's most respected investigative journalism programs, brought it all into the open. The episode exposed everything. The systematic abuse, the police inaction, the school's retaliation against Zhang. For the first time, the public saw the faces of the victims, heard their stories in their own words. The reality was more horrifying than anyone had imagined. And the reaction was immediate. Protests erupted outside Guangzhou's city government offices. Parents, activists, former students, all of them demanding justice. They refused to let the case fade into silence, like so many others before it. The pressure on authorities was overwhelming. The police, who had once stalled the investigation, could no longer look the other way. Under intense public scrutiny, they were finally forced to act. Within days, they arrested 6 perpetrators. The first to be taken into custody was Principal Kim, the eldest son of the school's founder, who oversaw operations and failed to act, despite knowing what was happening. The next was Vice Principal Kim, followed by 2 kindergarten teachers, all of whom were accused of sexually abusing multiple children in their care. But even with these arrests, true justice was still out of reach. Because what happened next would shake South Korea to its core. By 2006, the case against Gwangju Inua School had finally made it to trial. For the victims, this was the moment they had waited for. The moment when the people who had tormented them for years would finally face justice. But there was one problem. The legal system at the time did little to support victims like these. Many of the victims were deaf or hard of hearing, yet the court failed to provide qualified sign language interpreters. Some were forced to testify without fully grasping the complex legal terminology being used against them. Others had to depend on simplified translations, which often distorted their testimonies and made any important details lost in translation. And then came the cross-examinations. The defense was ruthless. They picked apart every detail, latching onto the smallest inconsistencies in the victims. They questioned their memories, their ability to recall events, even their perception of reality. But their most insidious argument was perhaps this. The defense pointed out that many of the victims had intellectual disabilities, and because of that, their testimonies couldn't be trusted. They claimed the children were easily confused, making their statements unreliable, since they supposedly couldn't fully grasp what had happened to them. It didn't matter that they had endured years of abuse. It didn't matter that multiple survivors shared the same horrifying stories. To the defense, they weren't victims of a terrible crime. They were just disabled kids who couldn't be trusted. Towards the end of the trial, the verdicts were announced. The principal, the man who had allowed years of abuse to continue under his watch, was sentenced to just 5 years in prison. The vice principal, one of the worst offenders, received only 1 year. His charge downgraded from rape to forced molestation. 2 other perpetrators were given less than 2 years behind bars. But even those sentences wouldn't last. Because in the appeal trial, the court reduced nearly every punishment. The principal's sentence was lowered to 2 years and 6 months. But instead of prison time, he was given probation. The vice principal, the man who had violated his students for years, walked free on a suspended sentence. By the time the trials were over, 4 of the 6 perpetrators were reinstated at the school, back among their victims, back in positions of power, as if nothing had ever happened. For anyone unfamiliar with South Korea's legal system at the time, these light sentences might seem impossible to believe. But there was a reason this happened. Back then, sexual crimes were not automatically prosecuted by the state. Instead, victims or their families had to file a formal legal complaint themselves. But for children with disabilities, many of whom were orphaned or had no legal guardians who understood the system, this process was nearly impossible. There was also a 1-year statute of limitations for filing complaints, meaning that if a child didn't come forward within a year of the abuse happening, they legally couldn't press charges at all. This loophole meant that many of the worst crimes at Gwangjo Inua School simply couldn't be prosecuted. And then, there was the most disturbing part of all. Back then, it was legal for child sex crimes to be settled privately between the victim's family and the perpetrator. If the abuser offered a cash settlement, the charges could be dropped entirely. And that's exactly what happened. Some families, pressured by fear, shame, or financial hardship, accepted money in exchange for their silence. And with that, the perpetrators walked free. Their victims, however, would never escape what had been done to them. Once the trial ended, public attention faded quickly. The outrage had been loud, passionate, and immediate. But without social media to keep the conversation alive, the case gradually slipped from the headlines. The world moved on. 4 years, it seemed as though they had won. Then in 2011, everything changed. A film called Silenced, also known as The Crucible, was released in South Korea. It was based on a novel by Gong Ji-young, a writer who had been so outraged by the case that she felt compelled to tell the story. The film offered a stark, unflinching look at what had happened inside Gwangju Inua School. The systemic abuse, the corruption, the failure of the legal system. But it wasn't sensationalized. It didn't need to be. In fact, survivors later revealed that the film left out some of the worst details. And still, it was enough to shock an entire nation. More than 4.7 million people in South Korea saw the film, nearly 10% of the country's population at the time. The impact was immediate and overwhelming. Viewers left angry, horrified, unable to comprehend how such injustice had been allowed to happen. Among them was then President Lee Myung-bak. So disturbed by what he had seen, he called for a reinvestigation of the case. This time, there would be no loopholes. But even with the public outcry, justice remained elusive. In late 2011, courts dismissed the case, citing a lack of evidence. Additionally, the victims' rights to file for compensation had already expired the year before, in 2010, meaning they had no legal recourse for the suffering they had endured. That same year, the school's principal died of cancer, never facing true accountability for what had happened under his watch. Yet, despite these setbacks, the weight of public anger could not be ignored. After a series of investigations, protests, and relentless pressure, Guangzhou Inua School was officially shut down in November 2011. The institution that had harbored unimaginable horrors was finally gone. As the rain gently falls and the night grows deeper. Thank you for joining me here at Mr. Night Scared. True crime stories remind us of life's mysteries and the importance of staying aware, even as we seek comfort in the quiet of the night. Let the rain carry you to a peaceful sleep, and until we meet again, stay safe, stay curious, and let the night watch over you.